The year is 793 AD, and the seas of the North Atlantic are alive with restless ambition. The Viking Age begins not only with raids on monasteries in Britain, but with a hunger to push beyond known horizons. These Norse sailors from rugged fjords of Norway and Denmark were more than warriors. They were explorers, craftsmen, and seafarers whose mastery of longships gave them unmatched reach. The longship itself was a marvel, light enough to be dragged onto shore, yet strong enough to weather stormy seas. By the late 10th century, Viking voyages were expanding westward, first to the Shetland and Faroe Islands, then to Iceland, and ultimately to Greenland. But to the Norse, the world did not end at Greenland's icy cliffs. Rumours of fertile lands further west, where grapes grew wild and forests stretched endlessly, stirred imaginations. These whispers, preserved in sagas, set in motion journeys across a cold and treacherous ocean. For the first time, Europeans were on the edge of a continent that had been home to thriving native civilizations for millennia, a meeting of worlds that would shape one of history's most intriguing and overlooked encounters. The crossing itself was perilous. Viking sailors relied on the sun's position, coastal landmarks, and keen memory rather than compasses or charts. They studied the flight of seabirds, the behaviour of whales, and the drift of currents to guide their wooden ships into the vast Atlantic. Weeks of uncertainty lay ahead, where storms could scatter fleets and icebergs loomed without warning. Yet determination, survival, and opportunity outweighed fear. These were not accidental wanderers blown off course. They were deliberate voyagers chasing wealth, honour, and settlement. Each voyage carried not only warriors but families, livestock, and tools, the essentials of life transplanted into the unknown. This relentless drive eventually brought them within sight of new shores, forested coasts, rocky headlands, and rivers rich with fish. These lands would later be remembered as Vinland, the land of wine. To the Vikings they appeared as fresh frontiers ready for use, but to the native peoples who had long thrived there, they were home, filled with stories, ancestors, and meaning. Two vastly different worldviews were now sailing toward an inevitable crossing, one carried by ships of oak, the other rooted in centuries of belonging to the land. After weeks at sea, the first sight of land appeared like a miracle. Jagged coastlines rose from the horizon, draped in dense forests and bordered by rivers that shimmered in the summer light. For the Norse, this was no barren outpost like Greenland. Here, they found wild grapes, berries, and meadows fertile enough for grazing. Streams teemed with salmon, and the forest promised endless timber, a resource scarce in their homelands. The sagas recall these new shores as Vinland, the land of wine, a place rich in life and possibility. Archaeological evidence at Meadows in Newfoundland confirms that Viking explorers built sod houses and temporary settlements here around the year 1000. These turf structures, with wooden frames covered by earth, offered warmth against the Atlantic winds. Within them, hearth fires glowed, iron nails were forged, and ship repairs were undertaken. To the Vikings, it must have felt as if they had stumbled upon the edge of paradise. Yet while the land seemed unclaimed to their eyes, it was already home to peoples whose ancestors had lived there for generations. Native societies deeply connected to the rivers, forests, and coastlines that the newcomers now explored. The Norse did not arrive as conquerors, but as settlers seeking resources and stability. Their ships unloaded supplies, animals, and tools, transforming the coastal site into a foothold for exploration. Small groups pushed inland, cutting timber, collecting grapes, and mapping rivers. Every step they took expanded their idea of what Vinland could offer, yet their presence was fragile. The sagas describe a tension between abundance and danger. They hunted game in the forests but remained wary of the unknown. They gathered fish from rivers but feared ambushes in unfamiliar terrain. Still, their writings preserve a sense of wonder. Vinland was portrayed as softer, warmer, and more generous than Greenland, a place worth returning to year after year. But these impressions were incomplete. The Norse saw only opportunity, not the native peoples whose camps, hunting grounds, and sacred sites surrounded them. For those indigenous communities, later remembered as the Skraelings in Norse sagas, these strangers were not discoverers at all, but intruders entering long-inhabited landscapes. The quiet beginnings of Vinland marked not just a Norse adventure, but the threshold of encounters with cultures that had shaped North America for thousands of years. Long before the Norse carved sod houses into the soil of Newfoundland, The land belonged to indigenous peoples whose ancestors had lived along its rivers, coasts and forests for thousands of years. Among them were the Beothuk, a maritime people of Newfoundland, who thrived on the island's rich resources. They built wigwam-like dwellings covered in birch bark and animal skins, set near rivers and bays where fish and seals were abundant. Their canoes, made of birch bark and laced with spruce roots, carried them swiftly across inland waters. Red ochre paint drawn from local minerals marked their tools, dwellings, and even their bodies, a tradition so distinct that neighbouring peoples came to know them as the Red People. To the north, Inuit communities had already mastered the Arctic, relying on kajak boats, seal hunting, and snow dwellings in winter. Farther south, the Micmac of Nova Scotia and beyond followed seasonal rounds, gathering shellfish, hunting caribou, and fishing salmon-rich rivers. Each group understood the cycles of their environment with precision, carrying knowledge passed across generations. To them, the forests and coastlines were not wilderness, but homelands layered with memory, hunting grounds, and sacred places, a world already complete long before sails touched the horizon. Life in these native lands was shaped by deep ecological balance. The Beothuk moved seasonally, travelling inland in winter to hunt caribou and returning to the coast in summer for fishing and gathering. Their diet reflected the rhythms of land and sea, sustaining communities through harsh winters. Tools of bone, antler, and stone were crafted with care. Harpoons for seals, scrapers for hides, arrowheads for caribou hunts. Oral traditions preserved stories of ancestors, guiding social conduct and shaping identity. The Micmac organised themselves in extended kin networks, with leaders chosen for wisdom and generosity rather than force. Spiritual ties connected people to the natural world, where animals and rivers carried meaning as much as sustenance. Inuit families, further north, developed survival systems that astonished later outsiders, from insulated clothing of seal and caribou hides to ingenious snow houses built in storms. Collectively, these cultures flourished in environments the Norse saw only as raw opportunity. When the Vikings landed, they entered a landscape already mapped by knowledge, traversed by canoe routes, and safeguarded by generations of tradition. What appeared empty to Norse eyes was in truth a homeland rich with memory, belonging, and meaning. The sagas describe the first encounters with the peoples of Vinland in language both curious and cautious. Norse texts referred to the Indigenous as skraelings, a term whose meaning remains debated but often translated as the small ones, or foreigners. These descriptions, though brief and biased, mark some of the earliest written references to native peoples of northeastern America. According to the Saga of the Greenlanders, the Norse first glimpsed groups moving along the shoreline clothed in furs, carrying bows and using skin boats. To the Vikings, these people were both unfamiliar and unsettling, their numbers large, their movements swift. To the Beothuk, Micmac, or Inuit who may have witnessed the sudden appearance of strange ships on the horizon, the reaction would have been equally sharp. Here were foreigners arriving in massive wooden vessels, unlike anything seen before. The sea, once a trusted provider, had now delivered unexpected visitors. Whether the first moments were marked by distance, curiosity, or quiet alarm is lost to time, but the meeting of eyes across water or clearing signalled the start of a relationship that would oscillate between exchange and hostility. Archaeological evidence suggests these sightings were not isolated. Temporary Norse camps at Meadows reveal signs of continued interaction, while indigenous oral traditions preserve stories of strangers who appeared from the sea. Some accounts tell of exchanges where woven cloth, metal fragments, or milk were offered, while native goods such as furs, food, or finely crafted tools were received. Yet mistrust lingered. The sagas recall moments when contact quickly soured, shouts, arrows, or sudden skirmishes breaking tentative silence. These early glimpses reveal a frontier where two worlds overlapped without understanding each other fully. To the Norse, the skraelings were obstacles to settlement. To the native communities, the Norse were intruders on long-inhabited lands. Neither side could yet know the other's depth of history or cultural weight. What survives are fragments, the words of sagas, the traces in soil, and stories passed through generations. Together they capture the fleeting intensity of those first sightings, moments where surprise and caution shaped the fragile beginning of contact between Native Americans and Viking explorers. In the fragile space between curiosity and suspicion, exchanges began. The sagas recount moments when Norse and native peoples bartered items unfamiliar to each other. The Vikings offered woven cloth, metal knives, and milk, while native communities presented pelts, meat, and finely worked tools of bone and stone. For a moment, the shoreline became a marketplace where two very different worlds met in tentative cooperation. Archaeological traces of Norse iron mingling with indigenous artifacts suggest such moments did occur. Yet, trade was never free of tension. Cultural misunderstandings were inevitable. What the Norse valued, the natives may have seen as ordinary, while what the natives considered sacred or essential, the Norse may have treated casually. Without shared language or custom, even small gestures carried risk. Still, these exchanges reveal a truth often overlooked. The first meetings were not always battles, but cautious negotiations for survival and advantage. Each side tested the other, watching for signs of trustworthiness or betrayal. Trade offered opportunity, but it also introduced uncertainty, a fragile thread binding strangers together, stretched thin by the weight of fear and expectation. Tension simmered just beneath the surface. The sagas recall disputes sparked by misunderstandings, a sudden quarrel over the value of goods, or fear when milk was rejected as strange. To Norse settlers, livestock and dairy symbolized stability, yet to many native groups who had never known such foods, the offering may have seemed unnatural. Likewise, the Norse hunger for furs was relentless, driven by the demands of Europe, while for native communities fur was a vital necessity for warmth, status, and tradition. When trade tipped toward exploitation or disrespect, tempers flared. Arrows and axes replaced goods, and skirmishes followed. These moments remind us that contact zones were rarely neutral. Every interaction carried stakes, survival, honor, and territory. For native peoples, protecting homelands was paramount. For the Norse, carving out a foothold was survival. The balance between trade and tension wavered constantly, never secure, always subject to the slightest spark. What began as cautious exchange often ended in mistrust, leaving scars that shaped every future meeting. Here, on the shores of Vinland, the fragile possibility of peace was tested and too often broken. The Norse who landed in Vinland carried with them a culture shaped by seafaring, farming, and raiding across Europe's coasts. Their identity was tied to the longship, to ironwork, and to kinship structures built around chieftains and law councils. They valued exploration and expansion, yet their survival depended on careful organization and shared labor. In contrast, the native peoples of northeastern America drew strength from a balance with the land. The Beothuk shifted seasonally, moving inland for caribou hunts, and returning to coasts for fishing, their mobility guided by ancestral knowledge of migration cycles. The Micmac organized themselves around extended kinship and alliances, led by wise elders whose authority was rooted in generosity and spiritual responsibility. The Inuit, in harsher northern climates, mastered survival through ingenious technologies: sealskin kayaks, fur-lined parkas, and stone lamps burning whale oil for warmth and light. Where the Norse relied on iron and timber, native groups shaped bone, stone, and hide into precise tools that mirrored their environment. These two cultures met not as equals in knowledge, but as strangers whose values and technologies reflected entirely different worldviews. The contrast extended beyond tools and survival strategies. For the Norse, land was something to be claimed, cleared, and settled, a resource to be divided and owned. For native communities, land was not property but home, inseparable from identity and spirituality. Rivers, forests, and animals carried stories of origin and sacred meaning, binding each generation to those who came before. While the Norse measured success in expansion and material wealth, native societies measured it in harmony, resilience, and continuity. Even their approaches to conflict differed. Norse warriors were trained for raids, valuing honor and reputation in battle. Native groups, while capable of defense and resistance, often sought to resolve disputes through alliances, ceremonies, or migration to avoid unnecessary bloodshed. These cultural contrasts explain why even peaceful contact could slip into mistrust. Each side looked at the other and saw ways of life both strange and incompatible. Yet within these differences lies the story's significance. It was not only a clash of arms, but a meeting of philosophies, one rooted in dominion, the other in belonging. Such contrasts would determine whether coexistence was possible or destined to fracture under the weight of misunderstanding. The sagas recount that the fragile balance between Vikings and native peoples could not hold. In one episode, Norse traders grew uneasy when outnumbered during an exchange. A sudden quarrel erupted, and arrows whistled from the tree line. The Norse responded with iron weapons, but their small numbers left them vulnerable. Another tale tells of a bull, released from a Norse camp, startling nearby native visitors. The noise sparked panic and anger, leading to skirmishes that left both sides wary. Archaeology supports these accounts. Fragments of weaponry, signs of abrupt abandonment, and defensive features in Norse sites suggest episodes of violence. For the Indigenous, conflict was not merely defence, it was the protection of homeland and resources. For the Norse, these fights revealed their precarious hold on Vinland. Each clash eroded the possibility of settlement and deepened mistrust. In sagas and soil alike, the message is clear. What began as cautious exchange quickly spiraled into survival-driven confrontations that neither side could afford to ignore. From the native perspective, defending territory was non-negotiable. The Beothuk, Mi'kmaq and Inuit all had established networks of hunting grounds, fishing sites and sacred spaces, and strangers intruding on them posed a threat to survival. Skirmishes with the Norse were not endless wars, but sharp, decisive actions to assert control. To the Vikings, accustomed to raiding across Europe, the ferocity of native resistance may have been unexpected. Here, they were no longer the dominant force, but outsiders facing peoples deeply rooted in their environment. The sagas describe Viking expeditions retreating quickly after conflicts, their ambitions checked by hostile encounters. Even the well-armed Norse could not sustain prolonged campaigns so far from home, with few reinforcements and fragile supply lines. For native communities, victory lay not only in pushing the Norse back, but in demonstrating resilience. The coastline remained theirs, the rivers continued to feed their people, and their traditions endured despite intrusions. These clashes underscore the central truth of Vinland. The Norse were temporary visitors, while native peoples were permanent custodians of the land, determined to defend it with skill, unity, and resolve. Centuries after the sagas were first told, archaeologists uncovered material proof that the Norse had indeed reached North America. In the 1960s, excavations at Meadows in northern Newfoundland revealed unmistakable traces of a Norse settlement dating to around the year 1000. The site contained the remains of 8 sod buildings, their outlines still visible beneath grassy mounds. Hearths with charred wood, iron nails, and a spindle whorl confirmed both domestic life and craftsmanship. The structures matched those of Greenlandic Norse houses, with wooden frames covered by turf walls that held warmth against harsh winds. Most telling were the ironworking remains, slag and a forge, proving the Norse smelted bog iron on site to repair ships and tools. This marked the earliest known metalworking in North America, centuries before Columbus, yet the site's small size suggested only a temporary camp, likely used for exploration and resource gathering rather than permanent settlement. For historians, these finds validated saga accounts. For native histories, they underscored that the Norse presence, while real, was brief. The Earth of Newfoundland held the silent memory of one of humanity's earliest transatlantic encounters, preserved in stone, turf and iron, and, beyond Meadows, further discoveries hint at Norse movement deeper into the continent. Butternuts found at the site point to journeys south, since the tree does not grow in Newfoundland. This suggests Viking expeditions explored areas as far as New Brunswick, or even the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Whetstones of Scandinavian origin have also been identified, linking trade or travel across wider distances. Indigenous oral traditions complement these finds, describing encounters with pale-skinned strangers who appeared briefly then vanished. Still, evidence is scarce. Unlike native communities, whose material culture remained rooted in these lands, the Norse left behind only fragments, their presence fleeting. Native artifacts, stone points, red ochre traces, birch bark canoes, continued uninterrupted, while Norse items appear like sparks in the soil, quickly extinguished. This imbalance of evidence reveals a deeper truth. The Norse were visitors, but native peoples were continuous inhabitants. Archaeology confirms not only that the Vikings reached America, but also that they could not displace or outlast the enduring lifeways already established there. Every artifact, from butternut shell to iron nail, tells a story of contact, brief, fragile, and overshadowed by native permanence. Despite their skill at sea and determination to settle, the Norse could not hold their ground in Vinland. The sagas recount repeated hostilities with native peoples, shortages of supplies, and the challenge of surviving without steady reinforcements from Greenland. For the Norse, every expedition was a gamble across the Atlantic, vulnerable to storms and distance. Their small camps, while resourceful, were no match for the established indigenous presence. When conflict flared, the Norse realized their fragile numbers placed them at constant risk. Even the bounty of Vinland's rivers and forests could not outweigh the dangers of isolation. After only a few decades, the sagas suggest the Norse withdrew, their ambitions collapsing back into Greenland and Iceland. What remains is not a story of conquest, but of retreat. The Vikings left little lasting mark beyond scattered artifacts. In contrast, native peoples continued their lifeways without interruption, their seasonal migrations, hunting routes, and spiritual traditions enduring as they had for generations. Where the Norse presence flickered and faded, native continuity remained unbroken. The endurance of these communities highlights a simple truth. America was not discovered in these years. It was already home, guarded and preserved by its original peoples. The reasons for Norse failure also reveal the strengths of native societies. The Beothuk, Mi'kmaq and Inuit thrived in environments the Norse found punishing. Their knowledge of seasonal cycles, subsistence strategies, and social organization provided stability and resilience. They did not need to cross oceans to survive. Their world was complete within the land and sea they knew intimately. By contrast, Norse settlers relied on connections to distant homelands, and without steady support their outposts faltered. Archaeology confirms this imbalance. While Norse artifacts vanish after a short time, native sites remain layered and continuous, testifying to centuries of presence. The endurance of native cultures was not only physical but also cultural. Oral traditions, kinship ties, and spiritual practices wove a fabric too strong for brief intrusions to tear apart. In the end, the Norse left because they could not root themselves deeply in a land already held by others. Native peoples endured because they had always belonged to it. The story of Vinland is therefore not only about the limits of Viking ambition, but about the permanence and resilience of indigenous life across the northern Atlantic world. The story of Vinland closes not with conquest, but with quiet retreat. The Vikings, bold sailors of the North Atlantic, reached the shores of North America centuries before Columbus. They built houses, forged iron, and sailed rivers rich with salmon, yet their presence faded almost as soon as it began. In contrast, native peoples endured, their lifeways, traditions, and homelands continuing without pause. The Beothuk, Mi'kmaq, and Inuit did not record their histories in sagas, but their memory endures in oral traditions, artifacts, and landscapes that still bear traces of their ancestors. Archaeology may confirm that Norse footsteps pressed into Newfoundland soil, but it also shows that they left little lasting imprint. The enduring legacy belongs to the native communities, whose resilience made the Norse experiment in Vinland brief and fragile. History, when viewed through this lens, reminds us that the first transatlantic encounter was not a discovery, but a fleeting intrusion into an already peopled world. It was native strength, not Viking ambition, that shaped the true outcome of these encounters. Today, the ruins of Meadows stand as a reminder of how two worlds briefly touched. The grassy mounds of sod houses whisper of voyages across seas, while the surrounding forests and rivers echo with much older stories, those of native peoples who have lived there for millennia. When we reflect on Vinland, we see more than Viking adventure. We see a moment where indigenous endurance prevailed, where knowledge of land and water outweighed foreign iron and timber. The Norse sagas tell one side of the story, but the land itself tells another, that native cultures were unbroken, guardians of a heritage far deeper than a passing camp. In this light, the encounter is not a tale of who discovered America, but of whose America it already was. The Norse may have crossed the ocean, but native peoples had already crossed time itself, carrying memory and survival forward. And so, the closing reflection is clear. The true story of Vinland is not about how the Vikings came and left, but about how native peoples remained, enduring as the first and lasting stewards of these lands.